1 basically tells us about the way Canaan was continued to be conquered, the starting point at the end of the life of Joshua. So historically, what you can think of is Genesis stands on its own. There's no other books that go with Genesis. It tells us the history all the way up until the death of Joseph. Okay? Then, or at the death of, actually it's the death of Jacob is where it ends. Okay? Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, all are telling the story of the Exodus, all the way of getting ready to go into the Promised Land. Joshua tells the story of the conquest of the Promised Land. And then Judges is actually covering a very long period of history. I think it's somewhere around 400 years. I'd need to check that to be sure, but something like that.
175.
What's that?
175.
175 years?
16 judges and 175
okay.
years.
Okay, so 100.
Google it.
Yeah, no, that's, you're probably right. 175 years and 16 judges is the book of Judges. That's a lot longer than just the lifespan of Joshua, even though the books are about roughly the same length. What we read about in the very first chapter of Judges, we find out that Joshua was very successful. Matter of fact, we learn in Joshua that there's only one battle in all of recorded history that we know that Joshua lost, and that was the battle at Ai, right after the conquering of Jericho. He was victorious everywhere he went. But this is the way it worked, and I don't have time to go through it in a total detail. Can you see my red arrow? Jericho is right here. Okay? That's roughly right in the middle of the land of Canaan. Okay? So what God did when the Israelites were told to come in, instead of coming in from the south, like up from Egypt like you expect, he actually had them march around, so they came into Canaan in the very middle of the land, the Canaanite land. So there were huge armies on above and below him, and they were surrounded. And actually, God used the events that happened to basically unite the entire southern Canaan. They all became one coalition. Okay, in those days, instead of having a single king that ruled a land, each city called its mayor, if you will, the king. He was the king of a city. And typically that city would be fortified, and it would own the surrounding lands and kind of conquer it. Okay? In social studies, they sometimes call that a nation state or something like that, a very small nation state. And anyway, all the kings in the southern part of Canaan, they all got together and they ran up to try to attack Joshua when he was kind of in the same area where Jericho was, right in the middle. God defeated them. And then as soon as that happened, the northern armies became afraid, and they all got together, and they came down from the top. And God defeated them as well. So that basically broke the back of the military of the entire land of Canaan, really in two major battles. What happened after that is Joshua began going down and conquering all the cities, the fortified cities. And as he did, the Israelites would come and they would move into the cities. He had it mapped out about whose inheritance was where. They were moving where they were supposed to be. But if you can imagine it as starting little flames, each city would be a new flame of Israelite territory. And then what was supposed to happen is the Israelites were supposed to expand out and remove the Canaanites. Okay, so Joshua was victorious everywhere. He conquered the whole land in that there was no more armies to oppose him, but he did not get rid of all the Canaanites yet. That was a longer process. And what was supposed to happen is the tribe of Judah would take their territory, and the tribe of Issachar would take their area, and everyone would handle their area. And so Judges chapter 1 tells us they didn't do that. And so the end of Judges chapter 1 basically ends with, but they did not conquer, but they did not conquer, but they did not conquer, going through what they did do and then saying what they didn't do. Okay, so that's how the book begins. Then in chapter 2, the story kind of continues. The tribes didn't finish their jobs, and God saw their faithlessness, and the Bible tells us that he left the Canaanites. He said, they're going to be a snare to you. Now, you're going to go after their gods. They're going to ensnare you. This is going to be a lifelong problem or a nation-long problem that you're going to have because of this. Okay? That is the beginning of what we call the cycle of the judges. The cycle of the judges goes like this. The people are doing well, so they begin to follow idols. When they follow idols, what happens? There are consequences. God allows some nation to come conquer them. They go into some form of captivity. Once they're in captivity, what do you think happens next? They repent. When they repent, God sends them a judge, an answer, and they come back. Now they're good again. They'll be good for a certain number of years, and the process repeats. Okay, that's the cycle of the judges, and we see it 16 times more or less in the book of Judges. Not every judge gets the full cycle told about them, but that's what's happening. In Judges chapter 3, there are 3 judges that are mentioned, the first 3. The first one is a guy named Othniel. That's Caleb's younger brother. And he, we're not even talking about that tonight, so I'll say it quickly. Basically, the people that were oppressing him were from Mesopotamia. That would be later what would be called Babylon, that area. Okay, so these are the pre-runners of the Babylonians. It's also the land where Abram was from originally. But they came and they oppressed the Israelites in the land of Canaan. Because of their sin, God allowed the Israelites to be conquered by the Mesopotamians for 8 years. They had 8 years that they were being oppressed. And after that, Othniel rose up, the people rose up with him, and he was called a judge because he was their military leader as well as their leader, their political leader. Okay? And he pushed them all back. And after that 8 years of oppression, they then had 40 years of rest. Okay? After him came, this was always my favorite story as a kid. I decided this was not, I don't think I learned this in Sunday school proper. I don't remember it, but wherever I learned it, I don't think it was in Sunday school. It was always my favorite, is Ehud the left-handed judge. And Ehud the left-handed judge, what he's famous for is he killed a fat man with a sword. He took his sword in his left hand, he strapped it to his right thigh. Their metal detectors was only detecting the other side, so he was able to get in to see the king, and he drew the sword and he stuck it in all the way in. And apparently 18 inches, the length of the sword, was still small enough the entire sword was left in the fat man, and he died. Anyway, that's how he rescued the people. He killed their king. And Ehud, he was a Benjamite, so Othniel was from the land of Judah, from the tribe of Judah, but Ehud is from the tribe of Benjamin. And this time, instead of Mesopotamia, it's a little closer to home. These were the Moabites. There was the fat man, his name was Eglon. He was the king of the Moabites. And he had gathered with him the Ammonites and the Amalekites. All of them are a little bit related to, they're not really strictly Canaanites, although they lived and acted like Canaanites. Okay? Moab came from Lot, Ammon came from Lot, and Amalek came from Ishmael. So all of those are kind of related to Abraham and his family. But they were all joined together under Eglon. Ehud rescued them. God allowed the people of Israel to be in bondage for 18 years before Ehud rose. So 8 good years, 8 bad years, they repented. 40 good years, then they went back to the same old ways. Now 16 bad years. 18 bad years, thank you. And then after Ehud, there was 80 years of rest. Okay, so the cycle is kind of getting longer. They were under oppression longer, but then their rest afterward was also longer. After that, and this is where we're going to begin reading. If you look in Judges chapter 3, verse 31, we have the only mention, the major mention, I should say, of of the next judge. His name is Shamgar. So after Ehud was Shamgar, the son of Anath, who killed 600 of the Philistines with an ox goad, and he also saved Israel. Now, who does that sound like? You read about a man doing that. Who do you think of? Samson. Oh, yeah, David. David as well. There were some mighty men of David. There were several of David's mighty men that had exploits like that. But judge-wise, who comes to my mind as a judge is Samson. He was really good at that battling. So Shamgar, and if you notice who he was fighting, Philistines. Okay, Philistines will eventually become, in the days of Samuel and Saul and David, the principal enemy of the people of Israel. They are the Canaanites that remained the longest. So they are full-blooded Canaanites, the Philistines are. And so what we're seeing is, first it was coming from a long way away, and then a little bit closer, and now Shamgar, the problem is actually happening right there in the land. Now, the land of the Philistines, it's on the west coast, and it's the plains area. It is, if you can see my pointer, kind of down in that region of Israel. So west and south in the flat green area, all those are nice, good plains. And that's where the Canaanites, where the Philistines had their stronghold. But tonight we're going to read about Deborah and Barak. So let's start in chapter 4, verse 1. The people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord after Ehud died. And the Lord sold them into the hand of Jabin, king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor. The commander of his army was Sisera, who lived in Harosheth Hagoyim. And the people of Israel cried out to the Lord for help, for he had 900 chariots of iron, and he oppressed the people of Israel cruelly for 20 years. Okay, so they're back in that time of sinning. God has allowed them now to become enslaved to the Canaanite king, Hazor. I'm sorry, not Hazor. His name is Jabin, and he lives in Hazor. Now, Hazor is way up north. It is still part of the land of Israel, but it's right, you can see my red, it's in that region above the Sea of Galilee, north of the Sea of Galilee. Okay, that's where Hazor is, and he had 900 iron chariots. Now, where do you need to drive chariots? What's that? On the flatlands. Yeah, roads are better. Chariots are not good mountain vehicles because they need horses to pull them up, and it's a cart, right? So if you're looking at this map, can you see some regions that probably it would be difficult for chariots to go? This region here where there's some mountains, kind of in the northwest, and then this spot this is Jerusalem. If you're on Zoom and you can't see a map, Jerusalem is basically even with the Dead Sea, kind of in that middle area, very mountainous. That Hebrew country there was very mountainous, and so they were kind of protected. But in all the flatlands, the chariots would reign supreme. Okay, they were kind of the tanks in the military world of that time. Men could hide in the chariot and duck down and shoot from it and be fairly protected. And they could also move fast and drive through. And anyway, they were very hard to overcome. And 900 chariots is a big army. Okay, that's where we find what's the oppression that's happening. Okay. Verse 3, then the people of Israel cried out to the Lord for help, for he had 900 chariots of iron, and he oppressed the people of Israel cruelly. Now, Deborah, a prophetess, the wife of Lapidoth, was judging Israel at the time. She used to sit under the palm of Deborah between Ramah and Bethel in the hill country of Ephraim, and the people of Israel came up to her for judgment. She sent and summoned Barak, the son of Abinoam, from Kedesh Naphtali, and said to him, has not the Lord, the God of Israel, commanded you, go gather your men at Mount Tabor, taking 10,000 from the people of Naphtali and the people of Zebulun. And I will draw out Sisera, the general of Jabin's army, to meet you by the river Kishon, with his chariots and his troops, and I will give you into your hand. Okay, and if you notice there at the end of verse 7, that's still a question mark. You see that? That's because she began that statement with, Has not the Lord commanded you? And then she said what the command was. Now, again, there's some geography here that's helpful. This is why I wanted to do the map, and I'm sorry it's not blown up very well. But Barak, so there's Hazor. That's where Sisera and Jabin, that's where they're from. This is the kingdom of the Canaanites. Their stronghold is up here in the north. Right close to there, 15, 20, 25 miles away, in this region right here, is where Barak is from. That's Kadesh Naphtali was the name of that city where it says he was from. So he's in this region, pretty close to the Sea of Galilee, up there, very much in enemy territory. Very much, okay? Now, Deborah, she is living in the land of Ephraim, and it says that she's judging the people. Okay, she is the current judge. She's a prophetess, and she is working as the judge of Israel at the time. And she is between two cities, between the cities of Bethel and Ramah. And Bethel and Ramah are right here. And if you were to draw a direct line, which of course you can't walk in a direct line, it's about 60 miles from Barak's home to where Deborah's camp is, where Deborah is doing her judging. Okay, definitely more than one day's march. Definitely a couple of hard marching days to get from top to bottom. And if you read what it says Deborah summoned Barak. Okay, so she's down here at the bottom. Bethel and Ramah, if you're listening on Zoom, are not terribly far from Jerusalem. You probably have a map in the back that has Bethel. It's in a lot of the maps of the Old Testament. That's where she's at. And Kadesh Naphtali is way up north by the Sea of Galilee. Okay, so she sends for him, and he travels all that way down for her to tell him an interesting thing. What did she tell him? Gather the men. Has not God commanded you? Now, some people think what she was doing is she was saying, you know, God has been telling you this. Why are you not listening to God? And there are other people that think that as a prophetess, this was a way of saying for the first time, Barak, God has commanded you to do this. So in other words, we don't really know for sure, and people kind of disagree whether Barak already knew this or not. I'm not sure. What I do know is when he said this, well, let's think about the strategy, okay? And again, this is really going to be hard to see. This was the reason I used this map program. Okay, if you look at the nation of Israel, there's this little jutting out section that looks like a little thumb sticking out, okay? About right there is where the river Kishon comes out. And then the river Kishon winds up toward the mountains, up toward the Jordan. It doesn't go to the Jordan, of course, but it goes up toward the mountains of the Jordan, okay? And around the Kishon River would be the flatlands, okay? So, in essence, what Deborah said God is telling Barak to do is you go get your 10,000 men, you put them up on Mount Tabor, that is right here, right by the Sea of Galilee. Get all your 10,000 men up there, okay? Sisera is going to roll his chariots around on the flatlands and get kind of away from his capital city, get down there underneath there. And then you guys are going to rush and trap them and push them into Kishon River and destroy them there. Now, the problem with that strategy is it means the people of Israel have to leave the mountains and go fight the chariots on the plains. That's where chariots do good. So yeah, you've got 10,000 men, but it's only coming from a couple of the tribes. It's not the entire nation gathering. And so the understanding here, and this is why I was saying this is a precursor to Gideon, because the Lord allows them to use more men, and but still it's going to be evident that this is God who does it. Does that make sense? 10,000 men is a lot. It's more than 900, but it's not 10,000 chariots. It's like 10,000 men against 900 tanks. Who wins? It's not even close. And this would be in that same kind of category. So what Deborah has told Barak God wants him to do is basically an act of faith. I want you to go gather the men, get all of the guerrillas and all the people that are working, get them all together on a single mountain, and then all of them swoop down. Now we're going to read in the song that they sing, if we get there, that they didn't even have a spearhead among them. They were back at the point where they were so oppressed. If you're the king, if you want to keep a people submitted to him, one of the first things you do is you take away their weapons, right? Those of you that are for the Second Amendment, that's the reason we're for it, is because it keeps governments from conquering us. And every conquered people, the first thing that happens is the ones who do the conquerors say, okay, we want to have the best arms on the field. So they would always eliminate, you can't make swords, you can't make spears. Eventually the Philistines would go so far as to say, you can't even have a blacksmith. If you need your plow sharpened, you come down from your home and you come to the Philistine shops and we'll sharpen your plow and your axe, but you can't have one. And the people in Deborah's day were in that way. So you had 10,000 very poorly armed soldiers, and they're supposed to rush down against 900 chariots and attack. Okay? So Barak is being asked to do an act of faith. And let's read his response. Barak, this is in verse 8. Barak said to her, if you will go with me, I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go. What's his response? It's, I've seen less evidence of faith, right? It's not the worst I've ever seen. Barak is actually mentioned in Hebrews 11 in the Hall of Faith chapter. Barak's name is mentioned there. So he is a man of faith, but it's not great. And her response is almost sarcastic. She said, I will surely go with you. Nevertheless, the road on which you are going will not lead to your glory, for the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman. Then Deborah arose and went with Barak to Kadesh. And Barak called out Zephalim and Naphtali to Kadesh, and 10,000 men went up at his heels, and Deborah went up with him. Okay? So her response is, okay, I'll go, but you won't get any glory because of this, and Sisera is going to die at the hand of a woman. Now, Heber, the Canaanite, had separated from the Kenites, the descendants of Hoab, the father-in-law of Moses, and had pitched his tent as far away as the oaks of Zaanannim, which is near Kadesh. When Sisera was told that Barak, the son of Abinoam, had gone up to Mount Tabor, Sisera called out all his chariots, 900 chariots of iron, and all the men who were with him, from Harosheth Hagoyim to the river Kishon. And Deborah said to Barak, up, for this is the day in which the Lord has given Sisera into your hand. Does not the Lord go out before you? So Barak went down from Mount Tabor with 10,000 men following him, and the Lord routed Sisera and all his chariots and all his army before Barak by the edge of the sword. And Sisera got down from his chariot and fled away on foot. And Barak pursued the chariots and the army of Harosheth Hagoyim, and all the army of Sisera fell by the edge of the sword. Not a man was left. That's a great victory. Especially when you consider one of the nice things. Do you remember how Ahab died? We mentioned Ahab in Sunday school. Do you remember how he died? This is a long, long time later, but I think it'll help understand why this is such a miraculous thing. Okay, Ahab was going to go attack someone. And he actually called the king of Judah to go with him. And the king of Judah said, before we go, we've got to talk to a prophet of God. And Ahab said, there's only one left, but I hate him because he never tells me good news. So they said, no, you need to call him. So the man comes in and he says, the king, that God has ordained that this will be the way that the king of Israel is killed. Okay? Ahab says, okay, I've got a plan. you dress up like me, and I'll dress up as nobody. And so when they went into the battle, he disguised himself as a normal officer. And this is one of those, there's several places in the Bible where it says, and a certain man, we don't even know who it was, a certain man pulled his bow at random and shot an arrow. And the arrow went into the chariot where Ahab was and pierced through the armor and mortally wounded him. That's how Ahab was killed, was a certain man shot an arrow at random, and all of his grand devices about avoiding the wrath of God were overcome. Anyway, that story ends with, he told his chariot driver, remove me from the battle. Right? It gives us a clue to chariot warfare. Chariots are faster than people. If you're being defeated, you can always come back and fight another day. So do you understand how miraculous it is that 900 chariots of iron, and to a man, they were all struck with the edge of the sword? Now, I don't know if what happened is what happened to the Egyptians, where their wheels bogged down, or if they just, I don't know. We're not told specifically the specifics of how God worked this miracle. But as far as I'm concerned, this is a miracle. You don't bring 900 chariots working together in a concentrated army and not escape. You should be able to go through and over or whatever you need to. And yet, because God was fighting for them, to a man, they were all lost.
I read someplace studying this that God sent a storm, and the chariots got marred up in the mud and so forth. Have you ever heard that? I can't remember where I read that.
No, I haven't read that specifically here. And it could be that in the Psalms, there are other places that this battle might be referred to, and I didn't go down and chase every place. So it could be that God sent a storm to mar up the wheels. He needed to do something. Well, he's God. He could do whatever he wanted and however he wanted it. But something was done to make it so that these Israelites were able to conquer an army that had been unconquerable for 20 years. It's a long time that they were in charge of everything. Okay? So, Sisera had to flee away on foot. Look at verse 17. He fled away on foot to the tent of Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite, for there was peace between Jabin, king of Hazor, and the house of Heber the Kenite. Okay, I'll take a quick pause and I'll remind you where that was. Okay, if you can follow the red bouncing light again. Mount Tabor is right here, right by the Sea of Galilee. The Kishon River is a little bit south and west. That's where the chariots were. At the beginning of that little section, it tells us in verse 11 where Heber the Kenite was living. He was living, if you will, in the flatlands that would be the escape route to get away from the Israelite army and to circle back to your home city. Okay, so if you can imagine Sisera, he was, Mount Tabor is here. Sisera is trapped. His home city is further up. It would make sense for Sisera to try to loop around to get back. And in that looping around, he would come across this Kenite family who was living apparently away from all the other Kenites. The Kenite people are very similar to the Bedouins of today. They lived in tents. They had a very farming way of life, and they just kind of roamed around. Okay, and so that's where this Kenite was living. And we read about Jael coming out to meet him. Jael came out to meet Sisera, that's the wife of Heber, and said to him, "Turn aside, my lord, turn aside to me, do not be afraid." So he turned aside to her into her tent, and she covered him with a rug. And he said to her, "Please give me a little water to drink, for I am thirsty." So she opened a skin of milk and gave him a drink and covered him. And he said to her, "Stand at the opening of the tent, and if any man comes and asks you, 'Is anyone here?' say no." I don't know why. When I first heard how Saddam Hussein was finally captured, do you remember that story? He was hiding in a hole with stuff kind of covered over them. And if I remember correctly, the soldier that captured him, what did he say? President Bush sends his regards or something like that. Do y'all remember that? There was a statement, kind of a statement of, we finally got you, when they finally found him. And here was this great ruler of a nation, big army, a very important person. And the video of him in that hole, all nasty and not clean, and he looked like he'd been hungry. It looked like it'd been a while since he combed his hair. He just looked rough. Does that make sense? I don't know why. When I first saw that with Saddam Hussein, it made me think of this guy, Sisera. Here he is, a mighty general with all these armies, and now he's hiding under a rug in a woman's tent and saying, please, can you just give me a drink? I'm just going to go there to hide. So that's what he's been reduced to. And now he's saying, you need to protect me, right? The great general is saying, you stand guard at the door. If anyone comes here, you protect me and tell them I'm not here. But Jael, the wife of Heber, I got ahead of myself. Oh, I'm sorry, I already read that. He asked for water, but she gave him milk and put him to bed. And then, but Jael, the wife of Heber, took a tent peg and took a hammer in her hand. Then she went softly to him and drove the peg into his temple until it went down into the ground while he was lying fast asleep with weariness. So he died. And behold, Barak was pursuing Sisera. Jael went out to meet him and said, come, and I will show you the man whom you are seeking. So he went into her tent, and there lay Sisera dead with the tent peg in his temple. So on that day, God subdued Jabin, the king of Canaan, before the people of Israel. And the hand of the people of Israel pressed harder and harder against Jabin, the king of Canaan, until they destroyed Jabin, king of Canaan. All right, so there's the end of the story. What happens next is an entire chapter of the song of Deborah and Barak, their victory song. And I had originally intended to read this tonight, but I don't think I'm going to. I will at least point you to verse 6. So chapter 5, verse 6. Okay, in the days of Shamgar, son of Anath, in the days of Jael, the highways were abandoned, and travelers kept to the byways. The villagers ceased in Israel. They ceased to be until I arose. I, Deborah, arose as a mother in Israel. When new gods were chosen, then war was in the gates. Was shield or spear to be seen among the 40,000 in Israel? My heart goes out to the commanders of Israel who offered themselves willingly among the people. Bless the Lord. All right. There's a lot there in that song that tells us more. First, we understand that this happened apparently at the very end of Shamgar's reign as judge. Deborah's right after that. Remember, that was what we read in verse 31 of chapter 3, the guy with the ox goad and 600 Philistines. And this is telling us that that was kind of happening down there in the south, while there was also oppression happening up in the north. What does it mean the highways were abandoned?
Everybody's scattered. Not everybody was afraid.
Yeah, they're afraid. When there's not a safe government, then driving or walking, going from place to place is a dangerous venture. Right? What's that? You don't have trade or travel. That's right. So you can't get goods in. And also robbers are going to be able to dwell on the highways, and so it just becomes a dangerous place that you shouldn't go. And that's what had happened to Israel. Why did it happen? She tells us. When new gods were chosen, when the people of Israel decided that God should not be their God, when they chose new gods, then they found that there was war at their gates. They couldn't win. And there was neither sword nor spear among the 40,000 of Israel. Well, what does that tell us? Well, I already mentioned that the 10,000 that up at Mount Tabor, I believe this is telling us they didn't even have weapons. They didn't have spears or shields or anything to really fight with. This is the miracle of God's victory. What else did it tell us? If there's 40,000 in Israel and there's 10,000 at Mount Tabor, there are 30,000 who stayed home. We had a very divided nation. And if we read the whole song, and it's nowhere near clear enough to see on the slides, so I won't show it to you, but the tribes that were right where she was and he was, they came out and helped, but all the other tribes didn't. So we're told, for instance, that Reuben, there's going to be a lot of searching of heart at Reuben. Why? Because they should have come out and they didn't. Where was Dan and Asher? Why did they stay at the sea in their havens instead of coming out to fight? And so there's a little bit of a judgment in that psalm where she is reminding the people of Israel that they didn't all work together and that only a couple of them. And God blessed for the few.
Matthew.
Yes, sir.
Verse 4 of 5. I think that's where I got the idea about a storm.
Oh. Okay.
This is an account of this battle that just took place, right?
Well, I didn't think it was as I was looking at that. So let me start in.
If you read in verse 20, it does start speaking of Sisera, and then it talks about the torrent of Kishon, as in maybe flood waters.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, if you look down in verse 20, from heaven the stars fought. From their courses they fought against Sisera. The torrent of Kishon swept them away. The ancient torrent, the torrent of Kishon. March on, my soul, with might. So that does make good evidence that the way God did it was definitely through Kishon rising, and that probably, and the mountain quaking. When I was reading verses 4 and 5, Lord, when you went out from Seir, when you marched from the region of Edom, the earth trembled, yet the clouds. You're right. Yeah, no, that makes a lot more sense. Often in songs, there will be a reminder of what God had done in the past. And when I read that, when I was studying earlier today, when it said, Lord, when you marched out from Seir and Edom are way down here. And so I assumed from that, I didn't read closely enough, that what that was talking about was a time in the past when God rescued way down there. And then when it says in verse 4, the mountain quaked before the Lord, even Sinai before the Lord, the God of Israel. Well, I believe Mount Sinai is off the map to the south, way down south. So the long quaking. So I thought both of those were references to how God had worked in years past. Kind of like when David has a victory and he says, just like you dried up the Red Sea, so you worked on my behalf. But I think you're right. I think the better understanding is the storm clouds came from here. That's not where storm clouds go, but the stars aligned and there was a crazy storm, and God, you marched in the thunders and brought the clouds. That makes a lot of sense. So I think that makes a lot of sense for how that happened. So think about that. What God did is God told Deborah to tell Barak to tell the men of Israel to meet at the mountain. And when that happens, God knew that what the people would do is they would bring their chariots to the right spot, and then God brought a flood. And the river did what it doesn't normally did, and the earth shook like it doesn't normally shake, and all of a sudden the people are where Israel wins and God works. Here's the deal and the big application. In some ways, it's the same as Jericho and the same as Gideon. And that is, God wins because God is God. The most important part to me of the story of Jericho, do you remember when when the commander of the army of the Lord marched, was standing out in the field, and Joshua saw him, and Joshua went up and challenged him and said, who are you? Who are you for? Are you for Israel or are you against Israel? And he said, I am the commander of the armies of the Lord. I'm for God.
You don't think he might have been the I am?
I think it very could be the I am who appeared that day.
Yeah. Well, maybe.
And the point that the commander was making to Joshua is, Joshua, you don't need to be asking, am I on Israel's side? You need to be asking, is Israel on my side? You've got it flipped. And in the story of Joshua, the story of Jericho, they win not because they're good and not because they're strong. They win because they obey God. And God does the mighty work. Sisera, they don't kill Sisera because they have 10,000 soldiers. They kill Sisera because God does the work. Gideon doesn't win because he has 300 very smart men. He wins because God does the work. And each case, what we see is the people of Israel are supposed to have faith in him and obey him based off of that faith that they have. I believe Barak's listed in that hall of faith because he was willing to gather 10,000 men and be called their leader. It was a death sentence. If they don't win, he is most wanted in the nation. And he had to expose himself and put himself out in front. And it would have been better if he had just obeyed. And Deborah said, since you didn't obey, we'll let this other thing happen. Thoughts?
She only asked for 10,000. Deborah only asked for 10,000 men.
Well, I believe Deborah was saying the command of the Lord. You're right. The Lord only asked for 10,000. That's right. That's right. Would come.
There is this stipulation in the law that we talked about this with Gideon. It's in Mosaic law that men are scared they can and should go home before a battle.
Yeah.
All much the same.
Okay.
That either way through that.
Yeah. Brady's right. In the law, it's written that men who are afraid to fight should not fight. They're supposed to go home. The ones that are, in other words, there was no conscripted soldiers in the land of Israel. They couldn't force you to fight if you were afraid to. Now, anyway, there's some peer pressure there. But anyway, that happens a lot with courage anyway. Now, Becky's point is that God said 10,000. That was the number God said. And that's correct. But because of chapter 5 and the way it reads, I think the reason God said 10,000 is because that's how many were going to come. Now, seems like we wrestle up against this a lot, don't we? About, is it, who knew first? Was it God's will that only 10,000 should come? Or was it God's knowledge that the will of man was only 10,000 should come? Right? And my answer is always and still is yes. and I'm... That's right. And at the end of the day, all that wanted to come apparently came, and it was only 10,000, so that Deborah would later say, people in Reuben, where were they? They're going to be really considering it. And at the same time, we can say God knew that 10,000 was what needed to happen.
What would have happened if it was 10,001?
I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, small sin.
Right.
Small sin.
Yeah. I thought this would be, and we just have a few minutes, but I thought this would be an interesting story to look at after Sunday. So Sunday morning, wives, submit to your husbands, right? And specifically, that whole passage is talking about in the home. And I said that Sunday. Wives, actually, I didn't quote it correctly. Wives, submit to your own husbands is the command. And yet here in the Old Testament, we have a woman who is a prophetess, okay, and who is a judge. She both heard the word of the Lord and she was judging the nation of Israel. Now, we have to be really careful. Just because the Bible records that an event happens doesn't tell us what God thought of the event. Right? So if you read back through there carefully, and this might be something for you to do on your own if you're interested. And Jana often tells me, by the way, when I say, man, this is really bothering me, she'll say, that's nice. That's the end of it. It doesn't bother her. So in some of these deeper things that we wrestle with, theological things, if it doesn't bother you, that's okay. It doesn't mean you're less spiritual at all. It just means it doesn't bother you, and that's okay.
There wasn't a worthy man to be a prophet in Israel.
Some people have taken that understanding that there was not a man that was worthy to do it, and so she had to step up and take that position. If we knew for sure that Barak had already been told by God and he was disobeying God, I would be 100% in that camp. And I would say what Deborah is demonstrating is that, men, if you don't step up, God might have to use a woman to do your job. And I will say this in the church. You go to any church in the nation, almost, and we are an exception. You go to any church in the nation, you will find more women serving than you'll find men serving. Just about any church. It's just one of those things that it seems like that happens all the time. And often, it's because men won't step up and do what God's called them to do. Now, I'm trying to say that carefully because I'm not trying to say at any particular instance one woman is doing wrong. And I don't think we can here either. There is no evidence that God was displeased with Deborah with what she was doing. Matter of fact, all the evidence is that he was pleased with her. He spoke to her. His word came true through her mouth, right? Sisera would be killed by a woman. That happened. The song is a song of praise to the Lord. There is no evidence that Deborah did anything wrong.
Does that not show you about availability?
Availability?
Yes. I mean, she was probably available.
It,
The other man would
it,
take the...
it looks that way. From an application standpoint, I can tell you this. One of the big applications to me, reading this and thinking about it, is I want to do what God tells me to do. If I'm in Barak's camp, I want to go without having to be told and send an escort and all the rest of it. I just want to go. And if I'm in Deborah's camp, I want to be obedient and do it. She also risked her life when she traveled that. It probably was closer to 80 to 90 miles by the time you go around and all the ways to get there, to go to that battle. But the point is we're to be available, yes, and willing to do what God tells us to do. Other thoughts and applications?
I know we've discussed this before. I think sometimes we fall into the trap of thinking things are mutually exclusive that they aren't. Like you said, I don't think you can read any part of this as an indictment on Deborah. That doesn't mean it's not an indictment on the men. That one can be happening without the other being necessary.
That's right.
She's doing exactly right by
Yep.
circumstance, but that's kind of the point is that, and that reminds me of what the passage, I know when we continue, we'll see the other half of it, and have to look at that in First Peter, whenever that was. With both, there's a charge to the other, and as you said, men don't get off easy at all. It's the burden is laid on a man, his responsibility to his family. I think I see something similar. I don't think I can't get around how it seems derogatory, at least to Sisera, that this would happen this way. But that doesn't mean that, like you said,
Right.
it doesn't have to be exclusive to the fact that Deborah was wrong.
I agree completely that Deborah could be doing the right thing because other people are doing the wrong thing. That could be true. She's not alone, and I just flipped off of it, but I can go back to it quickly. Miriam is an example of someone who's a prophetess She was never a judge, but she was very much a leader in the nation of Israel in the days of Moses and Aaron. So much so, if you remember, Moses and Aaron and Miriam basically revolted against Moses and said, why is he so special? And it was kind of the two of them together. And if you remember, the Lord actually judged Miriam strongest in that. She became leprous for a week. And that was a judgment to her wanting to take authority from Moses. And I say all that, that's not to say anything against her, except for that she was very much a leader in Israel. She would not be having that conversation if she didn't realize how much authority she had among the nation of Israel. There was a woman named Huldah in 2 Kings chapter 22. She was a prophetess that the people of Israel went and sought out. There was a false prophetess in Nehemiah. And then in the New Testament, we have Anna, which we just talked about not very long ago. It tells us that she was a prophetess. And then we have the 4 unmarried daughters of Philip in the book of Acts that were also prophetesses. That's a really tough one. And all of these show us that the Lord, throughout history, Old Testament and New, has spoken through women at times. I think that's important for us to see and understand. And Philip is very instructive to us, Philip's daughters, and what that looks like. But that's a can of worms we better not open tonight.
This isn't original to me. Actually, I think I learned this from you, Matt. But I think you presented the idea that the consequence of the fall is double-edged. That whereas women may seek to usurp, it's not like what we see here, for example, but the other half of that is men in their broken nature would seek to let that they would want to surrender that, as we discussed Sunday, that office, not
Yeah.
that office. And this is just another thing that I think of this in the story again, not that Deborah was wrong, but just another indictment of the standard of time then.
My dad is one of the most manly of men you'll ever meet. He's the kind of guy that literally has shot a nail through his hand on numerous occasions. He's a hard worker, and he doesn't let pain or fear or anything get in the way of what he's trying to accomplish. And I could tell you story after story. I came home one afternoon, and there was a 1,200-pound golf cart that was broken that was in the back of the truck. I said, how's that back? And remember, Florida doesn't have hills. He said, yeah, I put it back there. I still don't know how he lifted 1,200 pounds into the back of the truck. He said, I got a bar. Well, anyway, but it's those sorts of stories. And something my dad has said for years is that it's not all young boys grow up to be men. And one of the things we're missing in our culture is that there's a lot of young boys who don't realize what it means to grow up and be a man. And what that looks like, every one of us, I don't know, some of y'all might be past this, but every one of us, if you say, raise your hand if you want responsibility, or raise your hand if you want to play all day. Who chooses responsibility? And that's what men would like to do. And so because of that, very often, their wives have to step into a role that they might not even want. But it comes to it. And then add to that because of the fall. And remember when when God was talking to Eve, he said, your desire will be for your husband. And I think that there was in that statement something about there being a conflict in the home that there wasn't before the fall, about who is in charge and how that looks and all of those things. And so, yeah, it is a two-way pulling of men not wanting to be who they're supposed to be, and women kind of wanting to be who they're not supposed to be, and then there's a battle between the two of them. I'm not willing to say that I think Deborah did anything wrong. I don't even know. I don't think Barak should have needed Deborah to go home with him. But outside of that, I don't know that there's anything else that's wrong. But it does make us at least consider it. at least think about what's going on and how that looks. And anyway, it's deep thoughts. Brady, it's not fair. I keep telling you, you need to make sure you end on time, and then the kids keep coming in while I'm teaching. I realize that. What prayer